Ahoy! Captain Benzie here, coming at you with an intel report. This series analyses each unit to teach you how to counter it, and how to best utilise it in your own decks. Please note that I don't receive any form of payment for these videos, so if you're enjoying them or finding them useful, I would really appreciate it if you consider dropping a donation into my digital tip jar. I've put the link in the description below. Today, we're looking at the Nod Flame Tank. The third generation Flame Tank is a terror weapon of enormous anti-structure potential. Sporting powerful dual flame cannons, the Flame Tank can lay waste to masses of infantry, friend or foe, in a single attack. Flame Tanks are swift-moving monstrosities built from the Temple of Nod that coast across the battlefield and roast anything foolish enough to stand in their path. The flame covers a cone that covers 2 tiles in front of the Flame Tank and the 2 either side of those, bathing a total of 4 full tiles and annihilating any infantry caught within. Do note that this cone is not selective of what it hits. Friendly units caught in that inferno will be roasted just as quickly as enemy units, so be careful where you point those nozzles. Flame Tanks also do extreme damage to enemy structures. Lieutenant Strongarm's turret, Kane's Obelisk of Light, and the enemy base are all good targets for a Flame Tank's ire. Despite this fearsome strength against infantry and structures, Flame Tanks naturally cannot target air units, making these a great counter to Flame Tanks. They're also relatively fragile, falling apart quickly to enemy armour like Predator tanks and Sandstorms. If you're finding that your opponent is rushing Flame Tanks at your base, your best bet is to block their path with tanks. As these tanks have the radar ability, you can move them backwards and forwards across the Flame Tank's path to force them to move around you, all whilst taking damage from the tank's cannon shots. That said, even more fragile ground units can do the trick, forcing the Flame Tanks into taking the scenic route, delaying their arrival, and buying you precious seconds to send in a counter. So how can you run these terrifying units in your own deck? My personal favourite method of using Flame Tanks is to lean into their base melting abilities and finish the game quickly. Now this is risky and it requires a keen eye to spot the opening, and a canny mind to distract your opponent long enough. It also relies somewhat on the element of surprise. If your opponents anticipate a flame rush, they'll be planning to stop it. As such, this deck uses low-cost units to dominate the early game and to control the launch pads for the first missile. Militants for scouting, lasers for anti-vehicle, and flame troopers to deal with enemy infantry. This allows us a lot of counters, all for the single cost at the hand of Nod. The bikes and buggies are in this deck purely to deal with more troublesome units that the Hand of Nod units can't quite deal with, and to guarantee that first missile. Once that first nuke has launched, confuse your opponent by pressing their harvester hard. I like to use the missile squads for this, as they usually counter with more infantry. At this point you should have enough to build your first Flame Tank and send it hurtling towards your enemy base. Be aware of your opponent's vision and give them as little time to react as possible. An Oksana boost acts as the lid of the trap to finish their base as quickly as possible. It's important to note that you shouldn't tunnel vision on the base at all costs. This deck isn't purely aiming to win by melting their base, but by dividing your opponent's attention. The threat of base melting forces your opponent to evaluate their priorities. Do they need to stop the flames or secure the next launch? As your aim is to divide your opponent's focus, it's important not to lose your own. This is why the first missile is absolutely vital, as it now demands your opponent fight to defend their base and seize the pads simultaneously. This deck does also work with Seth instead of Oksana. Although the Flame Tank doesn't have quite the same terrifying speed, you can pull up a Flame Trooper unit close to their base to split their force further. Or you can use this as a further distraction to divert your opponent's attention. Of course, as my intel report on Seth explains, you can also use the drill pod to sneakily secure a pad in the early game and lock in that first nuke launch. It's also possible to swap out the bikes and buggies for Venoms and Banshees, but the higher unit cost of these can make it harder to get a flame tank out. If you opt for this variant, you'll find popping a harvester for the bounty very useful in getting your flame tank out onto the battlefield. The advantage of this variant is that the units used to counter air traditionally are not very good at countering flame tanks. Your opponent is more likely to be building attack bikes, pit bulls, or talons than they are predator tanks. This deck is also very effective against double harvester builds, which aren't so worried about that first missile, and instead aim to draw the game out long enough to overpower you with their tech units. Since it's absolutely vital that you secure that first launch for this tactic to work, their playstyle plays to your favour. I hope that's helpful. Be sure to check out my other intel reports if you're struggling against certain units, or looking for tips as to how to best apply a new unit in your deck. Also check out my Acting on Instinct series with analysis of game mechanics and solid advice on how to get ahead in Rivals. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and be sure to subscribe to be up to date and ahead of the game. Happy sailing, and see you on the battlefield!